At 08:47 hours, 4 Russian nuclear-capable bombers were heading straight for the Norwegian Sea with an escort of 2 fighters. While everything seemed routine for the Russian pilots, this would all change in a matter of seconds. The scramble order hit the Evenes Air Station at 08:51. 2 F-35s from 332 Squadron were wheels up by 08:55, climbing through Arctic sky toward an intercept point 380 kilometers northeast. But these pilots weren't flying a standard intercept. They swung south first, then curved wide over the Norwegian Sea before turning northeast, approaching from behind the Russian formation rather than head-on. That routing adds 12 minutes to intercept time, and it was worth every second. A head-on approach creates 700 knots of closure, less than 20 seconds from visual range to merge. Stern approach drops that to 400 knots, giving pilots a full 5 minutes to assess the formation before contact. But the real advantage is geometry. The Novella radar you see on these bombers points forward in a 120-degree cone, scanning for threats ahead. Approaching from the 6 o'clock means approaching from the pilot's blind spot, the one place Russian radar physically cannot look without the entire aircraft turning around. By positioning behind and above, the Norwegians created what fighter pilots call a perch, altitude advantage convertible to speed. If the Russians dove to escape, the F-35s would convert altitude to velocity and close the gap. If they climbed, they'd lose airspeed and become easier targets. If they accelerated, the F-35s had fuel margin to match. Every escape vector led deeper into the trap. Inside the Bear cockpits, SPO-15 Barracuda threat receivers showed empty sky. Novella radar sweeping the forward hemisphere found nothing. As far as Russian instruments knew, they owned the airspace. The pilots settled into cruise, watching instruments that promised safety for 7 hours of routine patrol ahead. Their instruments were lying, and in a few minutes, they discovered just how completely they'd been fooled. At 09:03, the F-35s reached intercept position, 80 kilometers behind the Russian formation, 3,000 meters above, completely undetected. The Norwegian pilots hadn't activated their radars. Didn't need to. Through their helmet visors, they were already watching 8 exhaust plumes burn against the Arctic cold, targeting computers building perfect firing solutions while broadcasting nothing. If this were a shooting war, every Russian aircraft in that formation would be finished before NATO's morning coffee got cold. That's because the AESQ-239 distributed aperture system had been tracking them since 200 kilometers out. 6 infrared cameras wrap the F-35, 2 on top, 2 on bottom, 1 on each side, feeding into a computer that stitches them into a single spherical image projected directly onto the pilot's helmet visor. Look down through your ejection seat, see targets below. Look over your shoulder, see what's behind. The aircraft becomes a glass cockpit in the most literal sense. The pilot sees through the airframe as if it doesn't exist. It's the difference between looking through a keyhole and having eyes in every wall of the room. Against the Tu-95s, DOS barely had to work. Those NK-12 engines are the most powerful turboprops ever built. 15,000 shaft horsepower each, driving contra-rotating propellers with blade tips that break the sound barrier. All that power generates heat. If you look at the thermal display, each engine glows at 400 degrees Celsius against a minus 30 degree sky. A 430-degree differential turns every bear into a bonfire visible from 200 kilometers. With 4 engines per bomber, that's 8 signal fires announcing Russian position to anyone with infrared sensors. The bears weren't flying a patrol, they were flying a "please track me" parade. The 2 F-35s split into combat spread, 2 kilometers lateral separation, lead at 30,000 feet, wingman offset south at 32,000. Not random positioning. Lead's cameras track the bombers from one angle. Wingman's cameras capture them from a different angle. MADL, the multifunction advanced data link, fused both pictures in real time, sharing targeting data through directional transmissions that Russian receivers couldn't detect. Each pilot saw a composite image built from 12 cameras. Twice the coverage, twice the accuracy, 0 emissions. The Su-33 escorts kept checking their 6 o'clock. That instinctive over-the-shoulder glance fighter pilots have made since 1915. Their N001K radar showed nothing. Threat receivers showed nothing. But 60 years of Soviet aviator instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The instincts were right. The equipment was just too old to agree with them. The escorts flew classic Soviet doctrine. 4. Pairs weaving around the bombers to screen the threat axis. Good tactics if you know where the threats come from. They were watching from the forward hemisphere, where enemies had always appeared. The F-35s were behind them, invisible, building targeting solutions on the escorts themselves. If the Su-33 somehow detected the F-35s and turned to engage, they'd face a beam defense, F-35s turning perpendicular to put closure rate at 0. This is because pulse Doppler radar works by measuring velocity. It filters out slow-moving objects like ground clutter by ignoring anything not approaching fast. Turn perpendicular, your closure rate drops to near 0, and the radar's own filtering makes you disappear into the noise. Meanwhile, the second F-35 circles to the engaging escort 6 o'clock. The Russian pilot chasing one ghost finds another ghost on his tail. The F-35's fire control computers calculated AM-120D solutions, radar-guided missiles that fly at Mach 4, track autonomously in the terminal phase, and carry fragmentation warheads that shred aircraft from 50 meters away. The Norwegians decided to announce themselves instead. What happened next would turn Russian confidence into confusion, and confusion into something close to panic. At 09:11, the lead Norwegian activated his radar for exactly 2 seconds. Inside the Bear cockpits, the morning went from routine to terrifying. SPO-15 threat receivers erupted, warning tones, flashing lights, the unmistakable signature of targeting radar. Every crewman knew that sound. Someone had them locked. Someone could take them out. Hands tightened on armrests, eyes snapped to threat displays. Then nothing. Radar vanished. Warning stopped. Displays showed empty sky. 2 seconds was enough. That's because the APG-81 radar you see here uses 1,200 individual transmit-receive modules arranged in a flat panel, an active electronically scanned array. Traditional radar rotates a mechanical dish to sweep the sky, taking 2.5 seconds per scan. AESA steers electronically by adjusting the phase relationship between modules, essentially pointing the beam by making some modules transmit microseconds before others. The result: the beam moves at the speed of electricity, repositioning in microseconds instead of seconds. Focus on 1,200 modules on a single point. Get precise range, velocity, and heading, then shut down before anyone can locate you. 2 seconds gave the Norwegians targeting-grade data on every aircraft in the formation. One burst, that's all it takes in a shooting war. The Su-33 pilots reacted on instinct, hard turns into the threat axis, radars to maximum power, gardenia jamming pods spooling up against whatever had just painted them. They searched with equipment that was relevant when disco was cool. Mechanical dishes sweeping left to right, 2.5 seconds per scan, looking for something that had already vanished. Nothing. 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 That's because the F-35's radar cross-section measures 0.005 square meters, roughly a golf ball. That's not an accident. The airframe is shaped so radar energy scatters away from the receiver rather than bouncing back. Edges are angled. Surfaces are coated with radar-absorbent material. The engine inlet is curved to hide the compressor face, one of the most reflective parts of any aircraft. The Russian N001K radar was designed to find carrier groups, 100,000-ton warships throwing massive returns across kilometers of ocean. Asking it to find a golf ball at 80 kilometers is like trying to find a regular non-influencer at Coachella. The Russian radar kept sweeping. The radar kept finding nothing. The gardenia pods pumped jamming into empty air, burning electricity against missiles that didn't exist, protecting the formation against threats that had already gone silent. But the F-35s weren't silent. They were listening. The ASQ-239 Barracuda electronic warfare system you see here on the F-35 records every emission within sensor range, frequency, pulse width, repetition interval, power level, modulation pattern. The SPO-15 detected the AESA frequency band? Logged. Couldn't determine bearing? Logged. The Su-33 reaction time? Jamming frequencies, Gardenia activation sequence, all cataloged for NATO intelligence libraries. Next time F-35s face these systems, they'll know exactly what to expect. The Russians were teaching NATO how their defenses respond to fifth-generation radar, and they still couldn't find the teachers. The bomber formation held course. A 2-second radar spike wasn't shooting. Mission continues. But inside those cockpits, crews were checking instruments obsessively, scanning empty sky for threats their equipment insisted didn't exist. Their radar said all clear. Their guts said, we're being watched. Only one of those was wrong. In 3 minutes, they'd finally see what had been hunting them, and it wouldn't make them feel any better. At 09:14, the F-35 slid into visual range, 500 meters off the lead bomber's right wing. Through their canopies, Norwegian pilots saw the glazed nose section, Evan crew at their stations. KH-101 cruise missiles hanging from external pylons. The same weapons that had struck Ukrainian apartment buildings 48 hours ago. Through the Beaver's windows, Russian crew finally saw what had been hunting them. Matte gray shapes that materialized from nowhere, sitting in perfect formation off their wingtip. No radar warning before visual contact. No detection whatsoever until they were close enough to count rivets. The escorts had to be asking themselves, where did they come from? The Norwegians had used a high-to-low conversion, starting at 5,000 feet above and directly astern, then descending along the bomber's flight path while slowly closing. This keeps the F-35 in the rear aspect cone throughout the approach, presenting the smallest possible radar cross-section to any sensor looking backward. Over 11 minutes, they closed at 350 knots overtake, invisible until the final moments. The final maneuver was a saddle, lead dropping to co-altitude and offsetting 500 meters right, wingman holding 2 kilometers behind the 2,000 feet above. High cover, in case an escort decided to do something aggressive. Why 500 meters? Close enough for photography, far enough to react if someone did something stupid. At that range, with 50 knots of overtake, the F-35 pilot has 3 seconds to respond if the bomber suddenly maneuvered. The Su-33 pilots could see the F-35s now. Human eyeballs worked just fine at 500 meters, but their radars still couldn't lock, even at visual range, close enough to read tail numbers. The N001K received less energy from the F-35 than it would from a seabird at 5 kilometers. The radar kept sweeping, and the radar kept finding nothing it could shoot at. The most advanced Soviet area fighter radar, designed to track American bombers at 200 kilometers, was being outperformed by a pair of binoculars. The Norwegian flight lead transmitted on guard frequency, the international emergency channel that every aircraft monitors. Russian aircraft, you are approaching NATO airspace. State your intentions. Silence, standard Russian procedure. Responding would mean acknowledging they'd been tracked and targeted without detecting a thing. Better to pretend the F-35s were scenery. Just ignore the ghost fighters that had appeared from empty sky and now sit close enough to wave at. The Russian escorts now faced an impossible tactical situation. Visual contact without radar lock meant their only weapon option was heat seekers, R-73 missiles using infrared guidance rather than radar. But engaging at NATO aircraft in international airspace means starting a war, and they'd lose that war fast. The F-35 in high cover carried AIM-9X Sidewinders, missiles with focal plane array seekers that track multiple heat sources simultaneously and thrust vectoring motors that let them turn harder than any aircraft can maneuver. The wingman watched through his helmet visor, seeker head slaved to wherever he looked, ready to fire the moment anyone made a mistake. The bombers continued their patrol. The F-35 settled into escort formation, close enough to document everything, invisible to every sensor that mattered. Now, the Russians would be photographed, recorded, analyzed, and cataloged. They just didn't know it yet. The Bears flew their planned patrol while the F-35s rotated through collection positions. Photographers at a fashion shoot where the models didn't know they were being photographed, and the photos would be used to put them down later. First position, beam aspect. Both jets offset to the bomber's 3 o'clock, 2 kilometers out, co-altitude. This matters because a radar cross-section isn't one number. It changes depending on angle. Beam aspect, looking at an aircraft from the side, shows maximum surface area and maximum return. The APG-81 captured signatures from wingtip to wingtip, documenting exactly how visible a Tu-95 is when a missile approaches from the flank. Hold for 30 minutes. Document everything. Rotate. Second position, quartering aspect. Jets shift to 4 o'clock, 45 degrees off the tail. This captures the transition. What happens when a bomber turns and a pursuing missile has to adjust? If an AIM-120 ever chases a bear and the bear breaks left, the seeker needs to know what that maneuver looks like on radar. How does the cross-section change? How does the aspect angle affect tracking? Now NATO knows. Third position, stern aspect. Directly behind, minimal cross-section, exactly what a tail chase missile sees during pursuit. Another 30 minutes, another complete data set. Every time the Novella radar swept, Barracuda logged the frequency, search mode, track mode, maritime surface search, air-to-air scan. Each mode uses different parameters, different frequencies, pulse patterns, and scan rates. By the end, NATO had recorded every radar mode the Tu-95 employs during a maritime patrol. That data feeds directly into jamming libraries. Next time these bombers approach NATO airspace, Barracuda will know exactly which frequencies to flood with noise. The radar will sweep and find nothing but static, and the crew will never understand why. DOS tracked thermal signatures throughout the flight. When bombers throttled up to change altitude, the exhaust temperature spiked, plus 47 degrees from cruise to climb. When they reduced power, the cooling curve was logged. This is important for missile targeting since a heat seeker like the AIM-9X doesn't chase hot things, it recognizes patterns. A climbing aircraft has a different thermal profile than a cruising one. A descending aircraft looks different again. Now the Sidewinder knows what a bear looks like in every phase of flight. The recognition algorithms just got an upgrade, courtesy of the Russian Air Force. Link 16 transmitted everything in real time, 128 time slots per second, each platform broadcasting position, sensor data, and targeting information in its assigned slot. Analysts at ground stations across Norway, the UK, and Germany watched the same picture the pilots saw. They were arguing about implications before the bears reached their turnaround point, drafting preliminary reports while the patrol was still in progress. The bear crews knew they were being watched. 7 hours of Norwegian fighters sitting off their wing made that obvious. What they couldn't know was the scale of what was being extracted. Every radar mode, every thermal signature, every emission pattern, all flowing into databases that would make these aircraft easier to find, track, and easier to shoot down. But the real intelligence jackpot came from something the Russians didn't even know they'd revealed. The Su-33 escorts radar, desperately searching for the F-35s, had cycled through every mode in its library, including a frequency-hopping pattern that NATO had never seen before. This wasn't standard equipment. The Russians had just accidentally demonstrated their newest electronic warfare upgrade, the same system Moscow was planning to sell to Iran next month. One patrol had just compromised a weapons deal worth $2.3 billion. The Russian Air Force had just become the world's most expensive product demonstration. That's when the Norwegian flight lead decided to twist the knife. He switched his APG-81 to LPI mode, low probability of intercept, and began painting the formation with frequency-agile pulses that changed wavelength every microsecond. To the SPO-15 threat receivers, it looked like multiple radars from multiple directions. Warning lights cascaded across Russian cockpits. Audio alarms overlapped into the incomprehensible wall of noise. The threat display showed hostile radars everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The Gardenia jamming pods activated on all 4 bombers, flooding the spectrum with noise, exactly what NATO wanted. Each pod broadcasts a unique electronic fingerprint, power curves, side load patterns, frequency response times. The Barracuda suite recorded everything, building a library of exactly how Russian jammers react to 5th-generation radar. Intelligence that would normally require a shooting war to obtain, delivered freely by crews who thought they were defending themselves. Then both F-35s vanished from the electronic spectrum entirely. Radars off, radios silent. Even their IFF transponders went dark. They became holes in the sky, visible only to human eyes, tracking the Russian formation through passive infrared while broadcasting nothing. The Bears' defensive systems went insane. Without active radar to track, the SPO-15 started classifying its own formation as threats. The lead bomber's Gardenia pod was jamming so aggressively that it triggered threat warnings on the bomber behind it. The Su-33's radar, desperately searching for the F-35s, locked onto the number 3 Bear by mistake, its own wingman, forcing the pilot to brake lock manually before the IFF system sorted the confusion. For 43 seconds, the Russian formation fought against itself. Electronic warfare systems attacked friendly aircraft. Radars locked wingmen. Threat receivers screamed warnings about emissions coming from their own formation. The carefully rehearsed defensive procedures collapsed into electronic fratricide. The Norwegians had done something remarkable. They turned the Russian formation into its own worst enemy without firing a single weapon. The F-35s recorded everything. Each false lock, each friendly fire incident, each system failure, all documented in excruciating detail. NATO now knew exactly how to make Russian defense systems attack each other without firing a shot. At 13:53, the Bears finally turned for home, but NATO wasn't done with them yet. Instead of breaking off the airspace boundary like a polite escort, the F-35s followed, and they brought friends. 2 Danish F-16s joined from the south, eager to participate. A British Typhoon appeared from the west, officially in the area for training purposes. The Russians now had a 5-aircraft honor guard they absolutely did not request. The Norwegian flight lead took position 200 meters off the lead bomber's wing, close enough that the Bears crew could see him give a small wave. The Danish pilots maintained continuous radar lock for the next 40 minutes. That warning tone singing in the Russian headsets like a car alarm that nobody could turn off. It's called aggressive escort in official NATO reports. Pilots have other names for it. The Su-33 escorts tried to intervene, positioning themselves between the NATO fighters and their bombers like bouncers protecting a VIP who'd already embarrassed himself at the club. The F-35 simply repositioned. Every time a flanker moved left, an F-35 appeared on the right. Every time one climbed, the other dropped below. The Russians were playing checkers. NATO was playing 4D chess. The procession continued east at cruise speed, no rushing allowed. The Danish F-16s had to keep tapping their speed brakes because the fuel-conscious Bears were flying like regional airliners, not strategic bombers. 400 knots, grandma speed. At 14:47, 2 fresh Su-30s scrambled from Severomorsk to receive their returning heroes. What they found instead were 4 bombers and 2 exhausted escorts being walked home by half of NATO like teenagers caught sneaking back after curfew. The Su-30 pilots formed up alongside, probably asking questions over encrypted channels. Bear crews definitely didn't want to answer them. The handoff happened at the Russian airspace boundary. The F-35s peeled off first, followed by the Typhoon. Then the Danish F-16s, each one giving a small wing waggle as they departed. The international fighter pilots signal for "see you next time." Bye for now.